Truck Talk, brought to you by eTruck Biz.
Hi everyone, Ben Wheel welcoming you and reminding you that this episode of Truck Talk is not endorsed, sponsored, approved, or otherwise affiliated with FedEx Ground or any company other than eTruck Biz. Today's episode is special because it's not our typical one-on-one interview format. Joining us are a few FedEx Ground contractors plus a couple of recruiting experts from eTruck Biz. And our topic is recruiting drivers because it has risen to the forefront of many contractors' concerns now that we're fast approaching the peak season. And a lack of qualified candidates applying for jobs is affecting everyone everywhere. That's why this episode is titled Recruiting Reinforcement, which has a couple of different meanings. To reinforce something is to strengthen it. We'll be discussing how to strengthen your recruiting efforts, plus how to strengthen your team by having reinforcements at the ready. So without further ado, let's begin. Today's guests are joining us from around our great country. We have Michael Albrecht, Frank McKee, and Tracy Taylor, who have been FedEx Ground contractors for a while. And from eTruck Biz, we have Seneca Bowers and Gary Wade. Let me start with Michael. Michael, please tell our listeners what you do, where you're from, how long you've been a contractor.
Thanks, Ben. Michael Albrecht. I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm a P&D and line haul contractor for FedEx Ground. I've been a contractor since 2018, but I've been with the FedEx world since 2005.
Welcome, Michael. Thank you. Frank, you're next.
Hi, Ben. I'm Frank McKee, and I was a contractor here in Greenville, North Carolina since 2015.
Welcome, Frank. Tracy, how about you?
Tracy Taylor here, FedEx Ground contractor for P&D and line haul. Contracted starting in 2012, but I've been around working for FedEx since 2008.
Super. Well, welcome to the podcast, Tracy. Seneca, please introduce yourself.
Hello, I am currently the Director of Finance and Administration. I've been with eTruck for just a little bit over 4 years now, and as part of that role, I am overseeing recruiting.
Welcome, Seneca. Thank you for joining us. Gary, you're next.
Good afternoon. I've been with eTruck as a director for actually 8 years now since we first got going, but prior to that, 30 years of operations management experience with FedEx Express on their P&D side of the business.
Well, welcome, Gary, and thank you all for spending your time with us today. So let's begin the discussion. Let's start with why recruiting drivers is more challenging than it ever has been. So, Michael, if we can, let's start with you. We'll go alphabetically. Provide your thoughts about maybe how the pandemic has affected recruiting.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ben. Well, first of all, I'd like to mention that recruiting is probably one of the most time-consuming jobs the contractor has to face, just from creating an ad and getting out there, finding the right person, following up with websites, making sure your ad is consistently running. It takes a lot of time. And then you add a pandemic where, the government is essentially helping everybody stay unemployed. It makes it even more difficult to find that right person, bring them in, get them trained, get them out on the routes. So, they're incentivized to really not work, which forces us to find ways to incentivize them to actually come to work.
So the pandemic kept people away. Frank, would you like to add some thoughts to that about maybe how the economy has affected and the supply chain has affected your recruiting?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen FedEx businesses grow somewhere around 40%, probably on average. And it's not just FedEx businesses, it's kind of everybody in the supply chain who's involved there. And, the lockdowns caused a rapid acceleration in the growth of e-commerce, and that's really changed, I think, the dynamics of the industry. In many ways, it's given the drivers a ton of leverage in the employer-employee relationship. The demand for their services has increased dramatically, and it's left a shortfall on the supply side of the labor market. And this has caused wage pressure on employers throughout the country as well. And then, as Mike said, obviously the current administration in Washington has not helped. They have not been very business friendly, offering incentives or enhanced unemployment and child tax credits in the form of monthly payments has, like he said, disincentivize people to come to work. and it's further restricted the labor market.
Right. Well, y'all are both absolutely right, and it's not just our industry that we're talking about. Tracy, what about, you want to add some other thoughts about that, what you see going on in Kansas all around you, where, recruiting drivers is hard because everybody's having a hard time finding employees now?
If you just look at the labor market in general, there's a supply shortage of people who are out there wanting to work, and you're seeing other businesses get creative in the ways that they're trying to attract people to go to work for them. Just the other day I was reading about employers hiring people today. You come to work and they're going to pay you tomorrow. So I think it's really prudent as FedEx ground contractors, to stay kind of ahead. Yes, we are limited somewhat to what we can and can't do, but I think if that's the trick, is to be more thinking outside the box on different ways and different places to look for people.
Right. Well, thank you for your input. I'll just say personally that recently I was walking around a high-end shopping area with my wife, and there were all kind of signs for accepting applications. And we also noticed, because it was after dinner, that a lot of the stores were closed earlier than usual. They weren't opening early and staying open late. They really adjusted their hours. And unfortunately, in the contracting business, you don't really have that luxury of just closing the store early because you don't have enough employees. So, everybody's looking for people. Government, economy, the pandemic, everything has just combined to make it a huge challenge, which isn't a secret, but I appreciate your input and your insights into this, and it just validates what everybody is feeling who's listening to this. So let's clarify next what we're talking about, recruiting versus hiring, because a lot of people use that interchangeably, and that's not really accurate. Recruiting is finding a pool of candidates or engaging and attracting candidates, then having a funnel where you track a long list of qualified candidates whom you can reach out to when you need drivers. It is not hiring and onboarding. Okay, so maybe Seneca, can you expand on that a little bit?
Certainly. So if you are consistently recruiting, then when you have an opening, you should have that strong network of candidates, as you mentioned. As long as you're upfront with them when you are interviewing them, that you may not have a current opening, but then when you reach out to them in the future, they may choose to come on board with you. At least you'll have a better pool than if you're just going to wait until you have that opening. You're going to be playing catch up. So if you're waiting till you have that opening to recruit, you're going to hire the first person and not the best person. When you recruit proactively, you're going to have that much wider choice of candidates to choose from.
Exactly right. Thank you. Thank you for that insight. Gary, you've been recruiting and working with recruiters for several years now. What have you witnessed about recruiting that you'd like to add?
Well, I think Seneca was spot on in pointing some of those things out. I've definitely seen a kind of a evolution that people originally were just recruiting after the need arose. That's when they started looking for someone, and they only sourced like a friend of a friend, that type of thing, word of mouth recruiting, and very few people offered benefits or anything outside of just the base pay. That's starting to change now because there's a growing realization that staffing is that root of all your problems, and to compound that or to counteract it, they're having to offer more benefits. So we're seeing more people now start to offer benefit packages, sign-on bonuses, things like that to induce people to come about, because there is the realization as well that recruiting does take up so much time, and if you don't recruit effectively, getting the top candidates, you're just going to be repeating that over and over again. And if you match that with the fact that if you don't retain your best drivers, you ultimately end up replacing them as well, which compounds your problems.
Okay, well, you've seen a lot. So to keep it moving along, we've talked about why recruiting is challenging now. We've defined what we're talking about and differentiated it from hiring. So now let's talk about the how to best address some of these challenges that you've all mentioned. I've heard the term gig workers in other industries, and with the lack of people applying to be drivers, should that be something that contractors should start considering? Seneca, let's start with you. Please define for our listeners what is meant by gig workers in the sense of with FedEx ground contractors.
Gig worker would be somebody who is a non-standard worker. So what we think of as a full-time or even a part-time worker that had a certain schedule. A gig worker would be used more on demand as needed, especially with like the flexible volumes we've seen with the FedEx world. So it's just an alternative way of hiring and using an employee so that we can cover the volumes.
It would be on an as-needed basis. Let's talk to some of the contractors about that. Michael, what do you think about that, and how would you maybe think about recruiting gig workers?
I think you'd be able to create an ad and post it for people that are looking for, spot work, looking for somebody that would give us a schedule of when they'd be available, or we could contact them if we had work for that day. They could come and work, and if they declined it, no big deal. We could move on to the next person. So having that pool of people, essentially just saying, yeah, I have availability today if you need me, and then having a group of contractors that could go in and just utilize them for that day and in a specific scenario would be a great asset.
Agreed. So you'd be open to it. Frank, what about you? Do you have insight onto recruiting gig workers per se?
Yeah, I mean, as a contractor, I never referred to them as gig workers, but that's essentially what I had. It didn't really take me long in this business to realize that I needed a wide variety of workers to ensure that I could always service my contract. Since I was always hiring, I came to learn that I had the most success recruiting when I had a job posting for both full-time and part-time drivers. I never wanted to discourage anyone from applying. I didn't always have a full-time job available, but I always wanted to say that I did so that I could collect resumes from people looking to work as a driver. And then, through conversations with them, I could at least find out what their current employment status was, possibly offer them a part-time, like a set part-time schedule like Seneca referred to, or a gig-type position where they could at least get their foot in the door with my company. And that's how the majority of my drivers started. And then I came to learn that some of them, or I'd say the majority of them actually wanted full-time work, but there were some that only wanted to work a couple days a week. And those people were invaluable to the company because they were the drivers that I would call on to fill any holes in the schedule, both those that I could see in advance as well as those that just popped up last minute. So these type of people would and actually they would end up having a fairly lengthy tenure, I guess, with the company because they were getting flexibility that they couldn't get in most other professions or industries or whatever. And because they didn't work a full schedule, they avoided burnout. For me, I utilized it a lot. I never called it a gig position. I was kind of referred to it as a part-time position, but it was these were people that weren't on the schedule at any set time. I would kind of have to get with them the week that we were making the schedule and find out what their availability was for that particular week, and then either have them on my backup roster or actually have them, like I said, fill a hole that I knew was there because somebody else was taking time off.
You were ahead of the trend by having gig workers, even though you weren't calling them that. Tracy, what about you? What's been your experience with finding, or have you had any experience with trying to find what we would define as gig workers?
I feel a little bit different than probably most guys do. We haven't really had a huge struggle in recruiting and finding people, but we do, I think, step outside a little bit of what the traditional norms are. We don't just rely solely on Monster, Indeed, all the major recruiting firms or hiring somebody to do our recruiting. Word of mouth is a big deal for us. The gig people, those are hard people to find, kind of like Mike was talking about here, or not Mike, but Frank was saying, he was bringing people in and kind of getting them put together in advance regardless of whether he had a spot. That's super important. They're out there. You just got to find them, and you got to be flexible, but you also have to make sure that your operation can be flexible to take those people in and out. I really liked what Frank was saying. You should be scheduling this week's people. Your schedule should be for next week, or actually even 2 weeks from now, because you've already set what you're doing this week and next week.
That's a good point. So you mentioned about scheduling, and Frank, you did touch on that. So if somebody were listening and they have a smaller operation and they really just have full-time people, Expand a little bit for someone who may not know or maybe just thinking about getting into the business and they're listening to this podcast. How does that work when scheduling part-time people, or maybe what are some best practices for scheduling people part-time or even gig workers, which may just be, for several hours if they're, don't even qualify as part-time?
For me, they were always they were, like I said, super important. They were the last people that would make that would get onto my schedule. I'd always kind of start the week with a template of everybody's penciled in. All my full-timers were penciled in. I did have part-timers that worked set days of the week, and they were penciled in. And then it was a matter of, like, taking those people out. They had a vacation day or whatever scheduled. And that's where I would kind of draw from my list of gig workers and just start inserting those people. And I had to make sure that the roster was deep enough with enough gig workers to make sure that if I, because you had to use some of them to fill the hole that you knew about. But then if you had to call out the next day, you also had to have your additional gig workers to come in that morning and fill the void. And so these people, like Seneca was saying earlier, it's super important when you're going through the interview process that they understand. I used to tell them you're going to work, you could work anywhere from 0 to 3 days a week. They knew that going in. And like I said, most of them would aspire to obtain a full-time job, but not all. I definitely had some that they only wanted to work a couple of days a week. And those people they're huge to my success.
Last mile delivery, I think, has become, one of you referred to e-commerce, the growth of e-commerce over the past few years. So I think whereas FedEx Ground wasn't set to deal with that traditionally, it's become a thing. So part-time people that aren't career drivers or may just be looking to work weekends has become a thing, because 3 or 4 years ago, somebody who wanted to work weekends, FedEx Ground wasn't delivering on weekends. Before, several years ago. So anyway, that's somewhat of a new phenomenon. Speaking about paying gig workers, Tracy, you mentioned something interesting about working today and getting paid tomorrow. And that's not been the traditional form of payment, but with technology and the introduction of e-commerce, expand a little bit about how paying gig workers would differ from paying full-time employees.
Anybody that works for you, you cannot treat them as a subcontractor. You can't 1099 them. The gig workers, some people, I think the general populace thinks that, gig workers are 1099s. I mean, it's just a new updated term of saying independent contractor. The gig workers that we're talking about here in this podcast is more towards flexible help, swing drivers, people that you can call on-demand help. It's kind of what I like to call them. But you have to treat them as employees. They're still going to get a W-2. You got to pay them above minimum wage. There's different ways to look at how you pay them. I do know I don't know if it's available everywhere, but out here they were doing some pilot programs with hiring people that brought their own vehicles in to deliver packages for us. We looked at it. We tried to kind of a couple people interested. So the interest out there, I just wasn't real comfortable with not knowing, my state's laws on how somebody bringing their vehicle to work kind of played into the grand scheme of things.
I believe they call that alternative vehicles. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, that is correct.
That's somewhat of a new phenomenon, too. Let me ask the group then about compliance and remaining compliance, because you bring it up, the fact that they are not independent contractors, they're not subcontractors for you. And in this podcast, we're addressing specifically the challenges of FedEx Ground contractors, and they have several things that need to be done in order to remain compliant. So let me throw this out to the group, or maybe start with Seneca, if you will. You still explain to the listeners, just because someone's a gig worker that you defined earlier, yes, they have to be your own employee, and they still have to go through First Advantage or the background checks and all that. Can you explain a little bit about that in case people aren't that familiar with what's required of being a driver and remaining compliant with FedEx Ground?
Certainly, they would have to go through First Advantage, which means they also would have to have their motor vehicle record, and so they'd have to be able to provide that and make sure that they were qualified in that regard. They would have to fill out the employment documents just like any other employee, which would include being run through E-Verify to make sure they're eligible for employment. And then as an employee, even if they are a gig worker, they still would need to clock in and clock out under some timekeeping system, because FedEx wants to see the hours that each driver is working. So they still would have to go through all the steps of a full-time or part-time employee in those regards.
That's a great point. We didn't even talk about timekeeping, but that is very relevant to what's going on now, right? And a big part of it, because as Tracy and others mentioned, they're not independent contractors, they are employees, and timekeeping is already important and will continue to be, if not more important. Let me ask the rest of you then, is there anything else that you would like to add before we move on to the next topic about scheduling, paying, remaining compliant, any of those topics?
Well, I think Tracy mentioned flexibility earlier in the conversation. I think that's really important because you kind of have to go away from previous ways you've done things and think about it in this regard. To fill a particular route, instead of just one driver, you may need to have 2 to 3 quote-unquote gig workers that actually cover that over the course of a week. And that goes against the way people normally have thought about scheduling. But again, the times are changing, and I think that's a change that needs to be considered.
Thank you, Gary. He did mention flexibility, and I meant to bring that up, but thank you for doing that. Let's move on to our next topic, because we're trying to be creative about helping FedEx Ground contractors in recruiting. We've heard the idea of the possibility of neighborhood-specific drivers. Somebody even threw out the term kind of drop shipping to a neighborhood. So again, this is a little bit non-traditional. Frank, tell our listeners a little bit about your thoughts around potentially having neighborhood-specific drivers.
I actually like the idea. I think it could be a way to save on rental costs, particularly in the lead up to peak, when in some markets, like here in Greenville, you have to rent trucks well in advance of when the volume actually picks up. And if you could instead hire a driver who brings his own vehicle under the alternative vehicle program, or you rent for this particular driver a smaller non-commercial vehicle for him to use, you could potentially save on a substantial amount of costs, I think. I also think you may have better success hiring a driver if you market specifically in those neighborhoods where those drivers live. So I think there's definitely some opportunity here, but it also undoubtedly comes with some challenges.
Trying to get creative here. Tracy, what about you? You got any thoughts about neighborhood-specific drivers?
It's a super interesting concept. I'm not sure in our business if we've got enough neighborhood density to pull it off, but I think what it really does is it underscores the importance of the need for everyone that's trying to get these packages delivered to really think about different ways to get things done while keeping the ultimate goal, which is cost control, because that's really, the whole sum of the business is controlling our costs, because we have no mechanism to control the income. So we have to watch how we, make sure that our people are being productive, so that we're paying them appropriately for the production that they're producing, and also, saving costs by, maybe you hire somebody because you've got, a 1-by-1 square area and it's all high-rise apartments, and you can hire a guy, you send a straight truck to 5 different neighborhoods that are like that in your town, and you drop off, 350 packages to each one of them, and that guy spends all day delivering to the apartment complexes. So I think it's just really important to open yourself up to thinking outside of the box and realizing the days of hiring a driver to come in and deliver here, and you just kind of get a set it and forget it, because the guy's on this specific route or whatever, they're gone by the wayside. We've got to adapt to what's out there and really take a different approach and think about things more, with the new 7-day network, you got to have a schedule for each day of the week instead of, well, I just have 52 weeks and 52 schedules. You need to have like 365 schedules, basically.
Let me just ask, Michael, do you have anything to add about, before we move on to the next one, about neighborhood-specific drivers? Have you thought of that or seen that?
I think this is probably the most interesting to me, because I do carry a pretty big area of of residential neighborhoods. And I think marketing that is really going to be a little bit easier because you can put signs up in each of those neighborhoods letting people see them as they're driving through. Do you know your neighborhood well? Are you looking for extra cash? And then utilizing the alternative vehicle program to have those people come in. You could set up something similar to what Tracy said. You could have somebody meet one of your drivers right onto the trucks and take that whole subdivision away from your current driver and having them just go knock out their neighborhoods. And if they know their neighborhood well, they're comfortable with it, they're going to be able to deliver it in a quicker fashion than possibly the driver you have going out there. So I think there's a good need out there for utilizing something specific like this in the neighborhoods.
Good point. Well, as Tracy said earlier, it may not work for everyone, but as you just said, it depends on your territory. If you've got a lot of residential, it might be a great non-traditional solution that people haven't thought of in the past, but may be necessary going forward. So we'll start kind of wrapping this up. And Tracy, you brought up profitability, which is very important and the overarching goal of everyone who's in this business. So expand a little bit for our listeners about solving this problem without breaking the bank.
Oh, well, Ben, I don't know if the solution I'm going to provide is what everybody wants to hear. Truly, the best way is to take a look at the amount of hours that you have people out there on the road and that you pay them an appropriate salary for the amount of time that they're out there. And I know there's lots of guys that pop up and say, well, I got, some unique special circumstance that is only unique to me and it's 10,000 times harder than everybody else. But really, it's not unique to any of us. It's just on a different scale. It looks a little different. That's the ultimate thing is why we're here is to make money. I mean, that's what profitability should be at the forefront. We want to take care of the people who take care of us, don't get me wrong, but we're all here to make a buck. And it's really important. I think that's where a lot of guys get kind of worried about this paid hourly thing because you have to manage more things. You have to do more work. It's not, I'm a FedEx ground contractor. I got 15 trucks. I don't even know where the FedEx facility is. I just got guys that show up and they go do it. That was fine 10 years ago. You could get away with that. But with, the lawsuits, just the way things have evolved, changed, what the labor force is looking for in terms of compensation, making sure there's fair and proper compensation out there, because it only takes one bad apple to ruin it for all of us. I mean, that's a pretty common theme here at FedEx. They come out with some good programs. A few people, take gross disadvantage of it and ruin it for all of us. To be profitable, the big thing is make sure that your people are being productive, that you have plenty of people available. I know since this causes recruiting, I brought people in, I'd get them qualified, especially with the new rules now where they're taking care of like DOT physicals and drug tests. I mean, what's the cost to get somebody active? Not a whole lot. And I always told people that. I was, I don't have a job for you today, Frank, but tell you what, let's get you qualified so when I do have a job, and maybe that's in 7 days from now, I can get you qualified in 3. I'll call you up and say, hey, want to come to work today? And we're ready to rock and roll with somebody instead of having to wait for First Advantage, wait for FedEx, wait for everybody else. We've taken as much control of the process as we can.
Michael, what about you? Would you have anything to add about, how you're going to solve the recruiting problem without breaking the bank?
I think monitoring your drivers and making sure you're training them the way you want them to run things is going to be key to keeping your profitability where you want it to be. Recruiting and getting the people in here is definitely a challenge right now, but you got to continue to recruit in order to find the right mix of people that are going to keep you at a profitable state. Bringing in 15, 20, 30 guys is good, and then using the ones that are actually making you money is even better. But you have to constantly recruit to find the people that are going to make you the money. And that's what I pretty much use every day in my mind when I'm putting together schedules.
So you let me ask you a follow-up then. It's crucially important How do you find the time to do recruiting properly when you are so busy? All you guys have mentioned, all the other tasks that you have to do, and I'm sure that some of our listeners are going, well, I just don't have time. There isn't enough time in the day. So how do you find time to do recruiting when you're so busy?
Originally, I sacrificed family time to do it, but I had to bring on an office person to help me with this labor market that we're currently in now. It's definitely a struggle to find time to get everything in, to get everything processed and get them approved. But I'm a bigger contractor now, so I actually had to hire outside an office manager essentially just to keep up with the current needs in this current workforce.
Okay, and Tracy, is that similar to you?
One of the things I wanted to throw out there is, the most valuable recruiting tool that's out there is the man in the truck. If he's happy and he likes his job and he likes who he's working for because he gets treated great, word of mouth is the best thing you can get out of people. And I think they say for every one positive, there's it only takes something like if you have one negative, it takes 10 positive things to overcome one negative. So if you got good, happy people out there and they're recruiting, and you can even look too, give them a little bit of something. It doesn't necessarily have to be $500 to recruit somebody. People love just the appreciation. It could just be a simple $10 to Amazon. Write them a personal card from the business owner saying, hey, thanks. Really appreciate you helping us out.
All right. Well, thank you for the insight there. Before we wrap up, I've still got Seneca and Frank and Gary. Let me ask you, if somebody says, I don't have the luxury of hiring an admin and following up on myself because I'm really busy, what's maybe another alternative for recruiting out there?
You can always outsource it. And the guys at eTruck are always willing to help. They will post your ads and process your candidates and run them through First Advantage if you want. So they can save a whole lot of time. As Mike was saying earlier, so many of these guys don't even make it through all the way through the onboarding process. So you are spending a lot of time to get drivers. And if you don't want to spend that time, there are companies like eTruck out there willing to help.
We sure are. Seneca, any last words from you before we wrap up this episode?
We made all the points on why you should continuously recruit. And again, eTruck can handle that for you so that you can focus on your operation.
Thank you for the plug. Gary, how about you?
Michael and Tracy both kind of highlighted something out there with the amount of people you're going to be bringing in, whether they're the traditional or more traditional hires or the gig type workers that we've discussed and all like that. It almost makes it come full circle that you need to be hiring and continuing your recruiting efforts, because the last thing you want to manage these people that you've now brought in, because they're going to need scrutiny on road to reach the profitability levels you're looking for. You're not going to have that happen if you fall short in recruiting and your manager ultimately ends up on road doing deliveries, because at that point, the people who need the management and the guidance are not going to be getting it, and that's going to erode your profits.
Very true. Well, this has been very insightful for our listeners, and we are bumping up against the end of our episode time. So thank you again to all our guests for today, and thank you to our listeners for listening to this episode. And be sure to join us for future episodes of Truck Talk by eTruck Biz, wherever you listen to podcasts.